Good morning. Let's start our Mahabharat class with some prayers. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Om Bhu Bhava Swaha, Tatsavitra Varenayam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Dhiyo Yo Nah Prachodayat, Asto Ma Satgamya, तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गम्य मृत्योर्मा अमृतं गम्य ओम सेनावतु सेनो भुनक्तु सवीर्यं करवावहि तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहि ओम शांति शांति शांति. Let's open our books. Mahabharat book. This is the volume 1 and page number 612. So far we have learned that the Pandavas, they are in the Badrika ashrama, that's where Nar and Narayana did the tapasya long time ago. And then one day Bhima and Draupadi, they went for a walk and they found some special divine flower. That's where we are, the divine flower, which is called Saugandhika. Saugandhika. So the title of this chapter is Where the Saugandhika Grows. As Bhim loped deeper into the forest, the fragrance of that Saugandhika was so strong that he knew he couldn't be far from where the flowers grew. Now it was not the scent of just one flower that filled the one, but of 1,000, a million Saugandhikas. This must certainly be Swarag he had stumbled into, thought Bhim. Anyway, not even heaven could smell any sweeter. Soon the jungle was dense and trackless, and the Pandava plowed on through it, following just the ravishing scent. As he went, he had to thrust dark, living liana out of his way. Vines that grew thicker as a man's arm and coiled themselves around any passing creature. At times, the creepers clung so swiftly and fiercely, Bhim had to cut himself free with his sword. So now Draupadi is not with him. Draupadi just wanted, because they plucked one flower the previous day and she gave that flower to Yudhishthira. And she wanted more flowers for herself. And Bhim has gone there to fetch some more flowers for her. There were the most exceptional monkeys and birds in the branches, peering down curiously at him. Some called out in astonishment to see the intruder. The birds were so vividly plumed, they were luminous in the twilight forest, and the monkeys had brilliantly colored faces like dancers' masks. There were other, more dangerous beasts in that forest, but this was their time for sleep, and none of them challenged the Pandava. Though wild flowers are of every imaginable kind grew in the jungle, he crashed through. Only a single fragrance filled the air, the heady scent of Saugandhika. There were bigger flowers than the little scarlet one. There were lovelier ones, but none of these could match the wild and perfect aroma of the tiny flower Bhim had come looking for. When he had gone an hour after he left Hanuman, he heard the swishing flow of water, and next moment broke into the sunlight of an open glade through which a cobalt river meandered. Its waters were indescribably blue, as if a bit of clear sky had fallen to the earth and turned into a river. But it was not the incredible blueness or sparkling clarity of the river that held Bhim transfixed. It was the riot of minute scarlet flowers that grew on its velvet banks. And upon its shimmering water, from the fragrance which hung over that place, they had to be Saugandhikas, all thousands and thousands of them. Had Bhim been a little more observant of his surroundings, he might have noticed the river's bank was a carefully tended garden. its shrubs and trees planted with order, its paths nearly laid. The water was gently damp with earth, so it formed a pool on which the Sugandhikas grew in thick beds. But Bhim was intent on plucking the flowers and taking them back to Draupadi as quickly as he could. He could hardly wait to see her face light up. Now the Panda felt very thirsty. The way through the forest had been long, and Hanuman's fruit lay heavy on his stomach. He strode up to the river, whose clear water was so inviting, and without a thought for any danger, knelt to drink. He did not see the many eyes that watched him from the trees. The moment his lips touched the sweet river water, angry cries shattered the silence, and in a blink, Bhim found himself surrounded by the weirdest beings he had ever set eyes on. More than a score of them. They were tall and lean, some were even handsome after a fashion, and though they were not Rakshasas, they were certainly not human. Their skin shone, and their eyes seemed like faceted jewels set in their long faces, some blue as the river, some leaf green, some wine red. More bizarrely, some of them had their feet turned back from their ankles, and others had holes in their backs, while still others walked bent almost in two, their hands trailing the ground. All of them wore clothes that seemed woven from bird feathers, leaves, and wild flowers, and some from large batches of butterfly wings. Bhim rose slowly and turned to face the eerie throng crowded hostilely around him. The leader of the being said grimly, "Who are you, mortal, that dare enter my Kuber's garden?" Another whispered menacingly, "Don't you know death is the penalty for drinking from Kuber's river?" Bhim did not flinch, only tightened his grip on his mace. After his encounter with Hanuman, he felt stronger and more unafraid than ever. Gazing back calmly into the glittering insect eyes of the leader of the motley crowd, Bhim said, "I am Bhim Sen, the Pandav. Vayu's son and Kunti's. I have come to pick Sugandhikas for my Panchali." "The flowers belong to our king. No one may pick them," cried the leader of the Yakshas and Guhaks. "But if you want flowers for your wife, you must come and ask our Lord Kuber for them. He is generous and may give you some, but then again, he may not." Bhim snorted at the idea. "Why should I beg for some flowers that grow on the river? I am a Kshatriya. The river flows free on the face of the earth. It does not belong to anyone. And neither do the flowers that grow in its water. I will pick the Sugandhikas and see who stops me." With shrill cries, the Yakshas and Guhaks attacked him. They carried short swords, some produced staffs and javelins, and they set on him from every side except where he had his back to the river. Bhim gave a roar that stopped many of those guardians in their tracks. Then he was at them like a tempest. He was so quick they could hardly see him, and so powerful they fell around him, helplessly, heads smashed, bodies shattered by his mace, the clear river stained with blood. No, in no time, those left alive fled from this fearsome mortal and back to their king in his palatial cavern, Kuber, lord of that jungle. Stopping nonchalantly over the corpses of those he had killed, Bhim waded into the river and began gathering Sugandhikas by the armful. As he did so, he sniffed them in delight, his eyes shining when he thought how Draupadi would love them. When he had enough flowers and much more, since he was never one to do things by halves, he laid them carefully on the mossy bank. He stripped off his clothes and bathed in the cold water, washing off the blood of the Yakshas and Guhaks he had killed. Meanwhile, those who had escaped arrived in some disarray before their king. Kuber was master of the treasures of the earth, a Lokpal and Shiva's friend. He was a Dev, and his luster filled his twilight cave palace. He sat with 12 red hounds at his feet and surrounded by a colorful array of jungle folk. Yakshas, Guhaks, Ganas, Siddhs, Charans, Gandharvas, Nags, Kinnars, and Rakshasas. Of all the secret sabhas in the world, Kuber's was the most opulent. Precious gemstones of incredible size and the fire were embedded in the walls and lofty ceilings of the maze of caves that was his palace. He himself wore few ornaments on his dark skin, but every ring, bracelet, or necklace that adorned him, whether of diamonds, emeralds, huge rubies, or pearls luminous as the moon, was a king's ransom. His throne was carved from a single sapphire, mined and cut in the earth's deepest past. It was the seat of his power. Kuber was a great sovereign of the earth. Now he saw his people run into him in shock. What happened to you? The Yaksha's leader cried. A terrible warrior appeared at the river. He drank your water and wanted to pluck Saugandhikas to take with him. We tried to stop him, but he killed more than half of us. Even now he is picking the flowers as he likes. Kuber murmured, One warrior? And he slew half of you? What is he? A Gandharva, a Dev, a Daitya, or a Danav? The tall Guhak turned his face down and whispered, No, Lord, he is immortal. A murmur of disbelief himself through the court. Kuber frowned for a moment, then a smile broke out on his face. He rose and said, I think I know who this mortal is. It is Bhim the Pandav, come looking for Sugandhikas for his Panchali. He is a friend. Come, we must go and welcome him to our kingdom. Kuber strode out from his palace, followed by as wild and varied a train of subjects as any king in heaven or earth would hope to have. Many of them wore ashes, jata, and rudraksh, for most of Kuber's people are Shiv Bhagats. They were all quite uncanny by any human norm. Some were as tall as two men, others short, but bright bodied. Some had more than one head. Some were so ugly you couldn't look at them, and others were as beautiful. There were chainlings among them who were wolves or serpents at times, but others had almost human forms with jewels in their heads. There were centaurs, fauns, and other lively ones who were spirits at times and had bodies at others. Back at the river, Bhim felt very sleepy. The king's water had this effect on those who were unused to it. The Pandav came out of the river and fell asleep on the soft grass beside the flowers he had plucked. He thought he would take a short nap, but he slept longer than he expected to. In Badrika Ashram, the day had worn into evening, and there was no sign of a being. Yudhishthir grew anxious, and Draupadi also. She said the forest was dark and seemed menacing. One of the rishis of the ashram added, Men have never been known to enter that forest. Mysterious creatures are said to live at its heart, but none of us have ventured in there, so we couldn't say if the tales we hear are true or not. Yudhishthir said, No creature can harm my brother, but it can't have taken him so long to find the Sugandhikas. Draupadi said, Let us call Ghatotkacha to take us to look for him. So they did. In a few moments, Ghatotkacha stood before them, his black hands folded graciously. Yudhishthir said, Your father is missing since morning. He went into the forest in search of Sugandhikas and hasn't returned. Ghatotkacha's eyes were worried. That is Kuber's one. The Sugandhikas grow on the blue river in the heart of the forest. They belong to the lord of the Yakshas. He does not take kindly to uninvited visitors. Yudhishthir cried, We must fly there. Draupadi said, Take me with you. It was I who sent him. I can beg Kuber for his life. There was no time to argue, and Yudhishthir gave in to her. Ghatotkacha picked them both up easily and flashed away from Badrika Ashram towards Kuber's darkling one. The sun was setting over the mountain's shoulder as they flew through the saffron dusk, bathed themselves in its callid colors. In no time, by fading light, they saw a river like a sparkling thread below them, weaving in and out of the sable forest like a bird. Ghatotkacha came gliding down and landed in Kuber's garden, where they saw a most singular gathering, amidst a crowd of yakshas, guhaks, and others, and seeming to enjoy each other's company hugely were Bhim and Kuber himself. Yudhishthir gave a cry of relief when he saw his brother. and ran forward to embrace him. Bhim came to Draupadi with his hands full of Saugandhikas, and when he saw her smile, he clasped her to him in joy that he had pleased her. They came before the Lord Kuber, and Yudhishthir and Draupadi paid obeisance to him. He laid a dark palm on their heads, blessing them. The Dev said, "You must spend at least a week with me here in my Kshetra." That was the name both of his realm and his garden. But Yudhishthir hesitated. "Lord, we came to the mountains to wait for Arjun. Only today I was thinking that perhaps we should go further north, lest he arrive there. Stay with me for a week, then return to Badri, and Arjun will come to the ashram," replied Kuber. They spent a charmed week with the Lord of Treasures, and there was feasting in Chaitra by the day and night, under sun, moon, and stars, and the singing never stopped, or the dancing. The wine and the food were fresh and more delicious than any served in the courts of human kings, and much to Bhim's delight, there was no end to either. Ghatotkach flew to the Badrika ashram and brought Nakul and Sahadev back with him to join the others. The Pandavas made many friends in Kuber's garden. Some were exotic and beautiful, some entirely grotesque. But their hearts were true, without exception, and they made Yudhishthir and his family welcome among them, most of all their mysterious and powerful king did. In the next chapter, Arjun returns now. For a magical week, there was uninterrupted festivity in Chaitra. Wine, food, and song. Draupadi learned to sing and dance with the yakshas, gokis, and forest gandharvis. But at the week's end, Yudhishthir came to Kuber on his sapphire throne and said, "My lord, we have been overwhelmed by your hospitality. But now we must return to Badrika ashram and wait for Arjun, for our hearts are full of him." Kuber gave Panchali precious gifts from his legendary coffers. The jewels she had from him were not of the earth but ornaments of the Devas. They were diamonds, moonstones, and rubies, and corals and pearls from the seas of worlds deep in the heavens. They were all stones of great power and fortune. At last it was time for the Pandavas to return to Badrika ashram. Kuber had the Sugandhikas that Bhim had plucked for Draupadi, packed in reed baskets. They took his blessing before they left because they knew that for all his geniality, he was one of the masters of the earth, the Dikpal of the north, the Lord of treasures. Yet not once during their visit did he seem any more than a wise and affable host. If somewhat ageless, since you could not begin to tell how old he was, not once did he reveal his other pristine form to them, that of an awesome Lokpal. Back to Badrika ashram, the days and nights began to seem long as years to Draupadi and the Pandavas. Every morning they awoke in the excitement that Arjun would return to them today, but each day brought disappointment. And at its end, they would lie in their beds, sleepless, wondering if he would arrive in the dead of night. Yet the ashram and its surroundings were tranquil and lovely and did not allow them to remain dejected. The trees of the nearby woods were all in bloom, draped in brilliant cloaks of flowers. They went on long walks together through the cedar groves, and even Draupadi was contented in Badrika ashram. Bhim was always dancing, attendance on her, going to absurd lengths to satisfy her every whim. He could climb the tallest tree or up to the most hazardous rock service to fetch a flower that took her fancy, and indeed they were reasonably happy. But after they returned from Kuber's garden, all their thoughts were full of Arjun. 5 years had passed since he left them, and they could hardly bear the separation anymore. One day they were out on a rambling walk, the Pandavas, Draupadi, and Lomas, Dhamme and his Brahmans, and some of the rishis. In the pine forest south of Badri, when Nakul, who walked ahead of the others, gave a shout and pointed to the sky. "Look, what is that?" A light like a piece of the sun, come loose, hung pulsing in the blue. Most of them had never seen anything like it, but Lomas smiled. "It is a Viman from Devlok." The gleaming ship of the firmament hung perfectly still, as if those inside it were seeking something on the mountain below. The Pandavas and the Rishis stood rooted. Next moment, in a silent, thought swift streak of light, the Viman flashed down to the earth and landed not 500 hands from where the Pandavas stood. A door at its side slid open, a stairway made of mirrors slipped noiselessly to the ground, and a Kshatriya climbed down those steps, smiling from ear to ear. Arjun screamed Draupadi and ran into his arms. Then Arjun knelt at Yudhishthir's feet, and Yudhishthir pulled him up and took him in his arms. Soon Bhim, Nakul, and Sahdev were hugging Arjun, and they were all laughing in absolute joy, tears in their eyes. Arjun prostrated himself before Dhaumya. He bowed reverently to Lomas and the rishis of Badri and embraced the Brahmins of Indraprastha. Such a reunion there was, and Draupadi just stood by, tears flowing from her dark eyes that never left Arjun's face. It was as if she was seeing him again for the very first time, as she had long ago at her Swamvara. Meanwhile, the elegant Sarathi, Matali, had come down the stairways. That was a threshold between this world and the another. Yudhishthir went forward to greet him with the Lomas and Dhaumya. Matali stood aside at the foot of the glass steps, and they began to throb with light. Indra, king of the Devas, came majestically down then. One by one, the Pandavas fell at the guards' feet. He blessed them all, and the rishis who stood tongue-tied. Indra carried a silver casket in his hands, and he called Draupadi. She knelt before him, and he pressed the casket into her hands, a small gift for my son's lovely wife. Indra turned to Yudhishthir. The time draws near when you will sit upon the throne of your ancestors in Hastinapur, and the world will pay homage to her emperor once more. Destiny moves swiftly, and the war on the edge of the ages is near. Another year and some months you still have to spend in exile. I have brought Arjun back to you, and I thank you for the time he spent with me. You will find it was well spent, for your brother is a master of Astras now. No warrior on earth, and perhaps none in Devlok, can match him anymore. As my enemies discovered to their cost, but I will leave that tale for him to tell. Indra clasped Arjun to him one last time, and Draupadi thought she saw a tear in the guard's stern eye. The Dev said, I must leave you now, and you must return to the Kamyak Aranya. He raised a hand over them and climbed back into his crystal ship. Matali embraced Arjun, then with a wave at Yudhishthir and the others, he too climbed back into the Viman. The stairway of the bearers withdrew without a sound. The Viman began to pulse with light again until those who stood on the ground had to turn their faces away. In a whisper, the great ship flew up into the sky. Quicker than saying, it was high above the mountain. Now it seemed Matali was having a little gentle fun. His craft was no longer a disk. Instead, a golden chariot had appeared in its place, drawn by 6 winged horses. Matali himself sat in plain view at its head, reins in one hand and a silver whip in the other. Behind him sat Indra, entirely glorious now. At those below watched spellbound. The white horses flashed straight up towards the sun and vanished. They went swifter than light. For a long moment, the Pandavas stood staring after the Dev. Then the princes linked arms and made their way back to Badrika Ashram. None of them spoke much. Their hearts were too full at Arjun's return. Often in turns, the other Pandavas would go near their brother and hug him or squeeze his hand as if to make sure he had really come back. Draupadi still walked between Yudhishthir and Arjun in a dream, holding both their hands, her gaze never leaving Arjun's face. At times she would smile to herself in some quiet bliss, and her eyes were full. Now Arjun tells the story to his brothers, what he did in the Devloka, because he had this the fierce fight with some of the Rakshasas also. Arjun's story. Back in Badrika Ashram, the rishis laid out a feast to celebrate. Arjun's return, when they had eaten, Yudhishthir said, Arjun, tell us everything that happened to you since you left us in the Kamnikwan. Arjun smiled. There was so much to tell. He himself was full of his most recent exploit in Devlok. But he began with his journey to Indra Kila, and his first encounter there was with Indra. He told them about his tapasya and how Shiv came as the hunter. He described his duel with the Vatal and how finally Shiv stood revealed before him and gave him the Pashupata Astra. Soon after the Lord vanished, the sky grew brilliant, and the Lokpals appeared before me. Varun, Indra, Kuber, and Yam, they all gave me their astras and the mantras to command them. Bhim said incredulously, you have the Lokpal's astras? Arjun shut his eyes. He made an occult mudra with his fingers, whispered a mantra, and those weapons appeared as golden arrows in his hands. With another mudra and another mantra, he made the astras vanish again. In fact, he had not truly invoked the Ayuds, just their shadows. If a Devastra was summoned previously, it would consume the one who calls it, or even the very earth. Bhim was the most obviously excited at Arjun's return. He would stroke his brother's face, take his hand, and his eyes would fill as often as Draupadi's. Arjun told them how Matali arrived on Indrakila in his Viman. He described the inside of that craft vividly in the flight to Devlok. Like a poet, he described Amravati, and his brothers smiled to hear him. It was so unlike the quiet Arjun to wax eloquent about anything, but the rishis of Padrika Ashram hung on his every word as if it were Amrita to them, especially when he spoke of Indra's throne, which the worlds worship. Arjun did not mention that the Dev king made him sit on that very throne. He only told his brothers later when they were alone. Arjun told them about the wine and the food in Amravati, its mountains and forests, Indra's garden and Nandan, and the lucent river that flows there. He told them about the lessons at archery with Indra and how he received the Vajra. He spoke warmly of Chitrasen, who became his friend and his master at music and dancing. Yudhishthir said with interest, you must show us what you have learned from him. Now Arjun said he was tired and would like to rest for a while, but he would continue his story later. The rishis of the Badrika ashram politely left the Pandavas and Draupadi together. When they were alone, Arjun said, I did not want to say what happened with the Apsara Urvashi when the holy ones were here. Panchali looked sharply at him and he blushed. She said in a tight voice, and what happened with the Apsara Urvashi? Arjun took her hand, not what you imagine. He told them how Urvashi came to him at dead of night. Draupadi's eyes glittered dangerously when he described how the Apsara made a midnight offering of herself. But she is a mother of the Kurus, and I told her I had only a son's love for her. That couldn't have pleased her, murmured Bhim. A smile was back on Draupadi's face that her husband had spurned an Apsara. She said many of our ancestors had been to Devlok as a reward for their punya and artha, and none of them had refused her. Arjun still shuddered to think of that night, but I couldn't see her as she wanted me to. I knelt at her feet and begged her to forgive me. Bhim laughed admiringly. She must have been angrier than ever. She was, said Arjun quietly. She cursed me. That fetched a gasp from his brothers and a cry from Draupadi. She whispered, what was the curse? That I lose my manhood and live among women singing and dancing as a eunuch. Lovely Panchali gave a sigh and fainted. Bhim sprinkled icy spring water on her face, and she awoke gasping for its coldness. She moaned, oh Arjun, what will you do? Has Urvashi's curse affected you yet? The others stared anxiously at their brother. He said, Indra had her reduce the curse to one mortal year, the 13th year of our exile, and for that time it will be blessing. Who will dream of looking for me in a harem of women? Draupadi breathed again, and his brothers began to laugh. You might enjoy this curse more than you are meant to, observed Panchali, Bhim murmured, though not as well as he would like to. Yudhishthir remembered. Rishi Lomas told us about a task in Devlok that Indra had for you. That is what you kept me so long. There seemed no end to my father's lessons at archery. Then one day he called me and gave me his Vajra. That was the last astra he had for me. You were always in my thoughts, and I was anxious to return to the earth. But Indra said I must do something for him before I left. One day, a month after Arjun had the Vajra from him, Indra called his son to him alone. You are a master of astras now, and not even the devas can face you in war, let alone any mortal. But you haven't been tried with battle, and the time has come for you to give me Guru Dakshina. I told you there is something you must do for me. I will do anything for you. Indra said, I wonder if you truly understand the power of the astras you have acquired. Do you think you could kill 30,000 Rakshasas for me as my Dakshina? Arjun was startled, but he would have agreed even if he did not have the Devastras. The Pandav asked, where shall I find the Rakshasas? The Nivat Kavachas live in the womb of the ocean of Devlok, said Indra. And Arjun saw his eyes misted over, for what reason he could not tell. They are sorcerers and very powerful. They were the pursuance once, and they have a boon from Brahma that no Dev can kill them, but only a mortal man. Our enmity is as old as Amravati, and for an age we have prayed for a Kshatriya who would rid us of the Nivat Kavachas. Their influence reaches down to the earth. Theirs is the power that Kans wielded and Jarasandh, the same power that now supports Duryodhan and his brothers as part of a web of evil spread across 1,000 worlds. A malignant disease afflicts creation and it grows at the very heart of their love. Arjun, for this too you were born as my mortal son, and for this task also you have come to Amravati. Will you go to their city and take fire to the Rakshasas? Arjun said, if it is in my power, I shall. The thought of his mission excited him, most of all the idea of using the astras in battle. Arjun was full of courage. He felt 10 times the archer he had been before. Indra had the rishis of his Sabha come and say some prayers over the Pandavas. This was done with grave solemnity, with all the celestials gathered in the Sudharam, Gandharvas, Kinnars, Devs, Apsaras, Siddhs, Charans, Nags, and the others. It dawned on Arjun that the task ahead was not a simple one. The Pandav did not sleep well that night. With the first light, Matali brought his Viman to the steps of Indra's palace. Indra himself was there to bless his son. Arjun looked into his face and saw a shadow of anxiety, lest he fail his mission and Indra lose his son. Arjun felt chastened when he saw Matali also wearing silvery mail, and with every auspicious talisman he owned hung around his neck. He realized the terror the demons inspired. Chetrasen, Chetrasen had come to wish him success. Even the Gandharv was somber that morning. He pressed a golden locket of protection into Arjun's hand and embraced him. Matali only said, your Gandhiv and quivers are in the Viman, and the virgin lies beside the Astras, where you will sit. He paused before adding, where only one mortal man has sat before. And who was he? Asked Arjun. A great Kshatriya than anyone before or after him, but he was not a battle in heaven, said Indra. Why didn't you ask him to fight the Nivat Kavachas? Matali laughed. That was before the Rakshas came to Devlok, and that Kshatriya's enemy was more terrible than they are, though he lived on earth. Tell me who the Kshatriya was, Arjun cried, though he had heard the legend before and should have guessed. Pray for his blessing today before you set out, said Indra. It was Ram of Ayodhya for whom I sent the Viman down to Lanka, so he could kill Ravana. Arjun knelt before Indra. All at once the Dev had a golden coronet in his hand, a jewel-studded kirit. Indra set the crown on the Pandav's head. You shall be called Kriti from now, O Kshatriya of Amravati. He collapsed Arjun once tightly. Then the Pandav climbed into the Vaman after Matali. The stairway was drawn up, and the Sarthi showed Arjun another place where he should sit today. It was a high seat above Matali, which could be thrust out of the body of the crystal ship when the warrior who sat in it did battle. How proud Arjun felt and how humble, sitting where immaculate Ram had once sat. He found that seat swivel to face every direction and prayed fervently to Shri Ram of old that he, Arjun, should not fail today. At the edge of his mind was the nagging certainty that this battle was as important as any he would fight later on earth, and its outcome would decide those of the rest. Matali passed his hands across the glowing panel that made the Viman fly, and the craft rose from the ground in a whisper, and they flashed away on their mission. Let's stop it here, and we'll see how this war with those Rakshasas go next time. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnase Purnamadaya Purnameva Visheshyate Om Shanti 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 Om. Thank you very much.